Hello, everyone. Welcome to the latest edition of Tony Talks. I am trying something a little bit different, so we'll see how this kind of goes, and if it works out well, then maybe we'll use this format. So one of my wife's students asked what was Tony Talk going to be for the week, and I really didn't have anything planned, so I guess that's all my fault. So I asked them, I said, well, what do you guys want to kind of learn about or hear about? And one of our students mentioned the Washington Monument in Washington, D.C. So I figured we could probably take like a couple minutes and talk about the monument there, because if you've ever been to Washington, D.C., there it is. The Washington Monument. It is dedicated to our first president, George Washington, and also he was the commander in chief of the Continental Army during the Revolutionary War. So he was a pretty important person as far as establishing our country and leading us to our own independence. And something that's kind of interesting. I came across a quote from a major general who fought in the Revolutionary War. His name was Harry Lighthorse Lee. And he said about George Washington that he was first in war, first in peace, and first in our hearts. And I think what kind of ties everything together, what I talked about last week, talking about Gettysburg and the Civil War. I mentioned the Major General's name was Harry Lee. His son would go on to become the leader of the Confederate Army, Robert E. Lee. So again, Robert E. Lee married a relative of George Washington, Mary Custis. So I guess way back then, everything kind of stuck together. So there's always those local connections as far as little inside stuff that people don't kind of always realize. But okay, so we're looking at the Washington Monument. It sits at the mall, which is called Washington, D.C. If you've ever been down there, I'm sure you've seen it. You could see it from miles and miles away. It sits on the edge of the reflecting pool on the opposite side of the Lincoln Memorial and the World War II Memorial, which is there. Looking the other direction, you can see the White House. This view here, you're looking over into across the Potomac and into Virginia. And on the left, if you could see that building, that's kind of like, well, it looks small, but it's actually one of the largest office buildings in the world. That is the Pentagon. So yeah, this is kind of in the central hub of Washington D.C. of politics, military, everything. It's what the design itself is called an obelisk, which goes all the way back into ancient Roman times. Not Roman, Egyptian times. A lot of designs had that kind of high spire point to them, and it was kind of meant to be like impressive, meant to be about courage and inspiration. So that design for monuments has been around for thousands and thousands of years. And in fact, if you go to cemeteries and other memorials, you'll notice that you do see these large obelisks. Of course, not this large, but you do see them in cemeteries, and it's a fairly common design. So it was dedicated to George Washington. Again, he was the first president of the United States. He was the commander in chief of our Continental Army. It's made of marble and granite. And what makes this, there's a couple things that kind of sets this monument off from a lot of others, is that there is no mortar. There's no like concrete. There's nothing that like holds these blocks together. So all these different blocks, the only thing holding them together is gravity. And the obelisk itself is 555 feet tall, which also makes it the largest monument in the world. So that's two like engineering feats that you do see. One, it's the largest monument, and two, there's nothing literally holding this together other than gravity. Um, Construction of this monument began in 1848. That's 60, 70 years plus after the Revolutionary War. But people wanted to have a monument to George Washington. But construction kind of halted in 1848. They kind of ran out of money, and then it wasn't kind of started back up until 1877. And as we talked about last week, if you can remember some dates, what happened, maybe in between that time period. Of course, we had the American Civil War. So that certainly didn't help things as far as getting things completed. There was other projects going on. The Capitol building itself was under construction. So there's other things than this monument that kind of needed to be completed before this, before they can find the money and the funding for it. So yeah, it was completed in 1877. And again, something that was kind of unique, and I'll show you this picture. When I mentioned that construction was halted, they only got about 150 feet or so completed. So what you see there is just the very basics. So from 1848 until they started working on it again, that's what it looked like. Once they finally got the funding to kind of complete it, something that's kind of unique, and if you've ever been to the mall in DC and you've seen this monument, you may have noticed it's almost like two different colors. So what kind of caused that is, I think that first picture shows it. So if you look at the bottom of the base of the monument, you see it's kind of like a lighter shade of white. Of course, they're getting their marble and their granite from quarries. Well, as time goes by, then that stone gets removed and used for other projects. So 15, 20 years go by and they decide to continue and finish construction. Well, they have to use a different part of the quarry. So that means a different kind of stone that gets involved with being able to complete the project. So, if you ever looked at the Washington Monument and wondered why, the bottom third of it is a different shade than the top 2/3 of it, you look at this picture, you can kind of see that's just because there was that 20 plus year gap in between being able to change quarries and getting the funding for it. So that's why it looks just a little bit different. Inside, you can go inside, and Washington D.C. is easily one of my favorite cities to visit because I love all the museums and the history and everything. But I've actually never been inside the Washington Monument. It's circled. If you see at the bottom there, you can see there's 50 flags representing each of our states. And then there's like a visitor center you could walk into in the bottom, and there's a metal spiral staircase that goes all the way up. And there's also later on they put in an elevator, so you can take an elevator to the top if you don't want to climb that 550 feet. And at the very top, if you look closely, you can see a couple small windows or some observation windows where you can look outside and probably see some spectacular views of Washington D.C. and you can probably look into Maryland and into Virginia. Because again, like I said, this is the largest monument in the world. DC has height restrictions on their buildings, so everything's kind of kept down low. So you could certainly see this monument from miles and miles away. And then to show you this last picture, it kind of gives you an idea of where it sits. Look in the top right-hand picture, that's the White House. That's where the President of the United States lives. And then different buildings on the side are State Department buildings. The Vice President lives in the building on the left. And then if you can pan over to the left of this picture, then you will see the World War II memorial, the reflecting pool, and then a few miles off, about a mile or so off, is the Lincoln Memorial. And then if you would pan to the right, you would see the African American History Museum, the American Museum of History, the Archives, the Smithsonian, and at the far end you would see the Capitol building. So this literally sits in the center of Washington D.C. on top of a mound, one of the more prominent points in the area. So if anyone has any questions, I will be more than happy to answer them for you. And we'll see how this kind of format of my Tony Talks kind of go. And again, it's always a work in progress, and I appreciate everybody who's listening, not just my wife's students, but there's kind of been a little bit of a following for people to kind of learn a little bit about history and just talk about 5-10 minutes or so about something unique. So thank you very much.